Sure thing. Okay. Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming and sticking around for an hour or so while we talk about some strategic planning. If you attended the 2015 NYLA conference, you may have seen this pop up on your program schedule. It's fairly similar to what I talked about then, with a few changes that I've kind of realized along the way of some changes that I've made to the process. But the simply strategic model, we came up with it, Lauren Moore and I of Pioneer Library System developed this one probably about 8 or 9 months ago. And the process, the idea of it is to take 2 to 3 months of data collection and analysis, more or less a sprint of just getting a bunch of information together that can be used for a 1 to 3 year long-range or strategic plan. And one of the first questions that I always get when I'm talking about strategic planning is, what's the difference between a long-range plan versus a strategic plan? And I generally use them pretty interchangeably, but they do have some pretty specific differences. And mainly a long-range plan assumes that what you know now is going to be the same for future conditions, and it makes the a plan that is implemented over a longer period of time, usually 3 to 5 years. Whereas strategic planning assumes that your organization is a little bit faster to respond to dynamic or changing environments, and it requires you to keep up to date with what's happening, so it's more agile, more or less. So that's why I call it strategic planning, because I look for planning 1 to 3 years out, so it can be a living document that you can update as you're moving along with your library and what's happening. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today, is how do you go through this process of putting a strategic plan together. And like Kelsey said, if you have questions, I'll definitely get to them at the end, but I'm going to run through the process and some of the activities that we do here at the Pioneer Library System to help out our libraries with planning. So the first thing I want to talk about is why we put this together. And the main reason, and the reason I want to talk about this, is because this isn't the only planning process that is out there, and it's not even the best planning process that's out there. So there's a lot of libraries that will have their own methods that they like to use. There's a lot of libraries that use the Sandra Nelson planning for results, and that's really great. And if your library can do that, that's fantastic. The reason that we put together this simplified version of it is because the traditional planning process just wasn't working for our libraries. To give you a sense of the libraries I'm working with, they're generally small, rural, smaller populations, and they would invest a lot of time into putting these hefty plans together that would last for 5 years or so. And what was happening is they'd finish up the plan, or they develop the plan, put it in a file cabinet, and then kind of forget about it for 5 years, and then they'd go back in and check off all the stuff that they've accomplished. And that's not necessarily the best way to use a plan. And the amount of information that they got, that was kind of the most manageable way to handle it. So we wanted to help libraries out, mainly because once they were done with that 5 years, there was a whole lot of effort that was put into developing a new plan. And we want libraries to be able to look at what's happening in their environment and be a little bit more agile in their approach to being able to manage a plan and goals and action items, and making it a bit more accessible to them. Plus, getting direct feedback from your community for data is really important, so that's why we wanted to have something in place that taught libraries, this is how you talk to your community on a regular basis. And a lot of our a lot of our libraries were doing this already. We just put some stuff in place that made it a little bit easier. And it also helps out because at the Pioneer Library System, we serve as kind of a facilitator for this process, and that was one area that helped our libraries keep things on track too. So the library directors, they're very busy, they don't have a lot of time for other stuff, and when you do something that's kind of outside of your normal day-to-day activities like planning, that's a whole separate project that's going to take a whole bunch of time. So we're able to act as more or less a project manager to help our libraries out with that a bit. So that's another reason that we put it together. We also wanted to be a go-to resource for libraries that needed to collect some type of data from their community, so we could help them out. Now, this plan or this process that we put together is not going to work for everyone, and also you may not even want to do all the stuff that's in the process or in the entire process. And that's kind of the way we developed it, is so it's more or less a menu of activities that libraries could pick and choose what they actually wanted to do. I'll get into that a little bit more later. And if you like your planning style that you're working with right now, that's great. You can stick with it, and maybe you will hear something today that you can help enhance that style. I always love hearing stories about different planning processes at different libraries, so definitely let me know if you've done something really cool, and maybe I'll add it to this one, because this is still in a huge testing phase, and it's very experimental because we haven't tried it with too many libraries. We're around 10 or so in our system. We've also worked with some libraries outside of our system to help them out with some planning areas, but it's constantly improving, and even since when I delivered this presentation at the 2015 NYLA conference, it's changed quite a bit since then too. So the first thing I want to talk about is how it works, so the overall process. And there's essentially 3 steps, and that's what makes it very simple. There's a lot of sub-steps in these 3 areas, but it starts out with an introduction meeting. This is essentially where you're going to start, why having a plan is important, what everybody will be doing in the planning activities. Then I go into the actual activities portion of it, where this is the planning survey, focus groups, interviewing community leaders, doing some type of board retreat if they're interested, collecting all of that data, and then bringing it all together for the analyzing phase. And this is where the broad strokes priorities come out, and putting the final plan together is also a huge part of step 3. So this is what the presentation is going to be on. I'm going to go into these 3 steps and talk about the intro meeting, the different activities that you're going to have, and bringing it all together at the end to have a final plan. So to start it out, the first thing I want to talk about is the first introduction meeting. And this introduction meeting is basically when your library board, where your long-range planning committee, where your staff, whoever's going to be in charge of getting this planning process taken care of, you're going to sit down and you're going to have a strategic conversation about what's going to happen during the planning process, because you really need to make sure that everybody's going to be on the same page, especially when you have a quick planning sprint where you're going to have a lot of information coming at you relatively quickly. You're going to want to make sure that everybody understands what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. So essentially this introduction meeting is going to set the tone for the overall planning process, and I encourage people not to have this as just a quick line item on the agenda for a board meeting. This should be a separate meeting where you're going to get into detail about talking about the planning process. And usually what this is if I was going to a library to do this, I would give a rough overview of the planning process, so essentially talking about the 3 steps that I went through earlier, talking about specific activities that people are going to want to do during this, deciding on the team. So if it is a full board and not the entire board may not be involved with this, you're going to want to break it up into a long-range planning committee. That is a decision that's pretty much up to the library. If you want to have a long-range planning committee, that's great. If your whole board wants to be involved, that's fine too. If you want to get staff involved, that's good. So whoever's going to be on that team is going to be really important. Also, during this introduction meeting, I highly recommend assigning a point person or a quote-unquote project manager, because what we've seen happen in planning and some plans that I've been involved with, what has fallen apart is this introduction meeting goes really well and people are excited to kick off the activities that we're going to do, but there isn't a clear person who's in charge of it, so it often falls on either the library director or the board president, and they weren't necessarily set up in the beginning to be able to manage this type of project, so things start to fall apart. It starts to fall through. So what you really want to do is find somebody who understands the planning process that you're going to go through that can be a real good point person that's going to be able to help everybody else move forward with this. Now this could definitely be the library director or the board president or a member of the board, the chair of the long-range planning committee, as long as it's someone who understands what's going on and they agree to be the go-to person for any issues that come up during the process. They're the ones that everything's going to be sent to. They're going to collect everything. They're going to keep everybody on point. The next step is to decide what activities you're going to do, because like I said earlier, you might not want to do all of them. And I'm going to go into activities in a few minutes, so don't worry about that right now. And then developing an action plan for the first step that you're going to take on each activity. So if it's going to be focus groups, first steps are probably going to be setting the dates and then finding people to come to those focus groups, looking for a facilitator, those types of things. So you want to make sure you have all that planned out and ready to go, and whoever's in charge of that is going to have that all documented, so they know exactly what's going to happen. And then I said that there should be somebody managing this whole thing, but there's also going to be a lot of people doing a bunch of other stuff. So who's going to be in charge of scheduling focus groups? Who's going to be in charge of finding participants? Who's going to be in charge of developing a survey? Who's going to be in charge of planning a board retreat? So any of the activities, you should have somebody in charge of those things as well. So whoever's managing this whole thing knows this is the person I'm going to talk to when we're talking about the facilitator for the focus group. So this is the person I'm going to talk to when we are looking at the survey timeline or anything like that. So having somebody to manage the project, but then also using the manpower that's there to be able to divvy up those tasks across those different activities that you're working with. And again, I'll talk about activities in just a minute. And then the final part of the introduction meeting is setting a timeline. So it's really important to work with some type of timeline as you're doing activities, because like I said, this is essentially a sprint and you're going to have a lot of activities thrown at you all at once. And a good way to set a timeline that I like is to start with a deadline. So whenever you want to have this planning process done. So I would say give yourself 2 to 3 months, depending on how quickly you need to get it done. Planning before you actually need the plan works out pretty well. I'd say if you need the plan for a very specific reason, like you need something for a grant that you're applying for, or for whatever reason, going through this entire process may not work very well for you because you don't want to rush it. You're probably better off extending your existing plan that you currently have. But when you start with a deadline, so say 3 months out, we have this deadline as we've adopted this as our final date where we want to have this plan approved by the board. And then you work backwards from that point. And when you work backwards from that point, that works well because you estimate how long it's going to take you to do the different activities. So for a survey, usually you're going to have that running 4 to 6 weeks. And you also have to have the data analysis time. So you're going to back up probably 8 weeks or so for planning when your survey is going to launch. And you need time to test and develop that, so that's going to work into that as well. Focus groups, those are pretty easy. It takes 1 to 3 days depending on how many focus groups you actually want to have, but the planning for it takes a little bit more time. So you may schedule your focus group dates a little bit later in your timeline, but you need a lot of prep work to get that ready. And same with the interviews for the community leaders. If you can depending on how many interviews you want to do throughout your community, you can have 6 or so hours invested in that, but you also need to set up those appointments to go and talk to people, or you need to make sure that those phone calls are scheduled so you can chat with them too. So there's a little bit of front work that needs to be done, so then later on in your timeline, that's when the activities are actually going to happen. And then when you're looking at the data analysis and review, so looking at all the survey information, the focus group information, the interview stuff, when you're doing the board retreat, the stuff that they've said, when you're looking at all this data, you need to analyze it in a way that it's understandable, and sometimes that can take a couple weeks. So usually 1 to 2 weeks, because you need to read it over, kind of have time to digest it a little bit, and then put a formal report together that you can then build a plan off of. So know what you're going to do and when you're going to do it is pretty important when you're talking about a timeline. But having a timeline is just going to keep everybody on task. What happens is we've seen it happen a lot, and it's not necessarily just in projects, but for libraries who are doing any type of project, they don't have necessarily a solid timeline, so things kind of get lost, and you drag your feet on this one, or maybe this one was waiting for a response, so it just takes a little bit more time. And changes, and so when that happens, it can slow the project process down because there's a lot of moving parts to this. So just being able to set up when you're going to do stuff is pretty important. Changes are okay if something comes up, but it's pretty important to have deadlines. And now onto the activities. So there are 4 main activities that I like to talk about during the planning process, and that's surveys, focus groups, interviewing community leaders, and then some type of board retreats. And the first one I want to talk about is surveys. And surveys get a pretty bad rap, and this is mainly because, no offense to anyone on the call, but libraries aren't the best at developing surveys. Actually, let me change a little bit. Nobody is really good at developing surveys unless you're in some kind of data analysis position, because surveys aren't just a matter of asking questions and then getting people's feedback on them. When you put a survey together, there's a lot of stuff that you have to think about. And another reason that they don't usually work out as well as we want them to are because we have these huge blown out community surveys with 50+ questions. Those surveys don't work either. People don't like to fill them out. They don't like to give their time to doing that. And the surveys aren't necessarily goal-oriented. And a goal-oriented survey is one that so you ask yourself, what do you want to know? So exactly what do you want to know? How will this data be used? And who do you need to ask to get this information? And sometimes those questions can be pretty obvious. So who do we need to ask? Well, the community. Well, it depends on the type of survey that you are developing too. If it's a community survey, then sure. But if you're doing a small desk survey, then your audience changes quite significantly from the entire community to just library users. So you have to kind of understand how you're going to put this survey together. And I'm not going to get into survey development too much on this call, but there's lots of different resources out there. I know SurveyMonkey has a really quick basically how to develop surveys, which works out really well, and I highly recommend that one quite a bit. And there's also a bunch of books out there. If you ever have questions about surveys, I've spent a lot of time with them, so I'm happy to take a look at them and see how they're working, see how they're doing with things. Some tips for when you're putting together survey questions. The first one is be clear and use uncomplicated language. So like any other industry, we use a lot of jargon, we have a lot of acronyms, circulation, ILL, catalog. Even catalog can be a jargony word that people don't fully understand. So you need to make sure that you are clear in the sense that you're not using any of the business terminology in a survey, because a library user in your community may not necessarily know what those are. And another consideration when we're talking about being clear is being as specific as possible. So I've read one survey question that said it was something along the lines of, how was the person at the desk? Okay, that's pretty ambiguous. It's not really clear. You'd want to work that into something a little bit different, like how would you rate the customer service you received during your last visit to the library? Okay, so you want to make sure you're as specific and clear as possible. The next one is you want to gauge opinions. So you want to keep it relatively personal, so in your opinion, in general, because what a survey is not is a test, and that's kind of what you want to avoid a lot. There was a survey I ran into from one of the, not in our system, but I saw it from another system, and it was asking about how the library was funded, and it had A, B, C, D, and different options that you could check off. So is the library funded by taxes? Does the town pay into it? Is it donations, or is it something else? And so that's a test question because there was no follow-up information on this is how the library is actually funded. And then the next question under that was about fundraising. So anyone who read those two questions together would think the library is fully funded by fundraising. So you have to be careful in what your survey is saying about your library as well. You're going to want to keep your bias in check. So loaded, leading, unbalanced, or double-barreled questions come up a lot when you're talking about surveys. So one may be, in the past week, how many well-used hours did you spend reading a book? I saw that one in a library survey. It's pretty loaded. Saying how many well-used hours is basically insinuating something for the library or for the survey taker. So it's liable to bias their answer a bit. Another one would be, in your opinion, does the library offer great services and resources? So maybe the library has good services, but not really good resources. So you have to avoid those double-barreled questions, and they happen a lot when you see surveys coming out from all kinds of different companies. Also, when you're working with surveys, you want to make sure that you consider every option, so don't force people into a choice if you don't have to. A lot of libraries that I've worked with have wanted to leave off the other part, so if it's a multiple choice question, they don't want other in there because they don't want that extra work of analyzing the other data. But you don't really, you'll get false answers aren't very good, so you want to make sure you give people the opportunity to give their full opinion. And that brings us to open versus closed questions. So open questions are ones where you just have kind of a paragraph box underneath where you ask a question, they can type in whatever they want. Closed questions are multiple choice or drop-down lists or something like that, checkboxes. And for data analysis sake, closed questions usually work out a lot better on surveys, providing that you do give that option for other. But open-ended answers can give you a lot of great feedback as well. I have an example in here of a brief survey, and you'll see some open versus closed questions when you're looking at that. And then the final point I want to make about surveys is it's really important to test surveys. And this is, so say you get together with a couple people, you write up a survey and you say this is great and you send it off to the community. And then you're finding as people are filling it out, there may have been a question people don't understand, or maybe they're interpreting it the wrong way. It's important once you actually write the survey that you want to use in your planning process that you test it out on a few people that weren't involved in the survey development process, and even better, test it out on a few people that aren't involved in libraries as well, and then that can be really telling to make sure that you're not using those jargony words, you're not using any leading questions, you're keeping all your biases in check. So having that test is probably just as important as creating a survey in general. So, and it doesn't take too long to test it. I'd say send it out to 5 to 10 people and just get their opinions on it. Don't have them just take the survey, but have them talk about the questions and how they're feeling about it. And that can help out quite a bit. As for survey questions, so the number of survey questions, I said earlier that gone are the days of having 50 questions set up on a survey. Usually I like to shoot for less than 10 questions, and if you need to ask more than 10 questions, you really need to think about splitting it up into multiple surveys, and that would work out a lot better. And that's okay to do. You would just need to plan how you're going to distribute those and the timeline that is that you're going to use for it. And it may not be just during that planning process. Maybe these data collection you want to extend past your long-range planning for getting data to either enhance your plan or to collect data for future things that you're going to need information for. And in that case, it would just be having a couple surveys a year. Now, some people worry about survey fatigue because that can happen. I would say if you're running a survey, like a broad survey, once every 6 months, that is probably okay. If you're doing smaller scale surveys in the library only about specific programs or services, those are fine. You can usually run those more like one every month or so, and you can collect a good amount of information. These survey questions that I have up on the screen right now, these are just some sample ones that we've recently been testing, and they've worked okay. We're constantly refining the survey questions that we are asking, and don't copy any of this stuff down because I have a link that I'm going to give you at the end that has the full test survey that we're currently using, and you can take the questions or adapt that any way that you want. So these ones are usually talking about, on average, how many times you're visiting the library in general. So these are those getting at the people's opinions, because surveys don't test behavior. They test people's personal opinions or perceptions, and that's what you really want to focus on, because that's the only way you're going to be able to get any type of information. And I've had a few libraries ask about the first one. So on average, how often do you visit the library in a typical month? The reason you do month and you don't talk about like looking at a year or how often do you visit the library, how often do you visit the library is pretty ambiguous. And when you look at year, people have a really hard time judging how many times they have done something over a long period of time. So it's kind of one of those things where you don't really get a good answer. So just thinking about an average number over a month, they can generally think like that. So if they go to the library once a week, then they know that they've done it 5 or more times, and they can select that. And we have an idea that it doesn't matter that they're 5 or more. What matters is that these people are heavy library users. And so we're going to look at these answers a little bit different from somebody who is 1 to 2 visits per month, because they're a less frequent library user. And when you're looking at the survey data at the end, it can be really great to play questions off of each other too. So if we look at the first question, so frequency of visits, and then we compare that to the main reason that they visit the library, you see some interesting trends. So the people that are there a lot, the last survey that they had, people who were there that were at the library 5 or more visits a month, they were heavy computer users, and they were using one-on-one training as well as programs. But people who were there less frequently were mainly book users. So you can kind of find those trends. Sometimes that's pretty obvious. I would probably have guessed that. But some are a little bit more interesting as you're looking at them. And you want to make sure that you customize, like if you use any sample surveys, you want to make sure you customize it, because the main reasons that people visit the library, the question number 2, you may not do some of that, or maybe you have something else that you test. What I discourage is having like a really long list of all the services that you have out there. I would say don't put any more on that list than what's right there, because what happens is people, they become satisficers, which is essentially they'll check whatever's at the top box so they can move on to the next question. So unless it's really heavily randomized, you want to make sure that you call that list quite a bit, and you only have a few things on there that you really want to test. And again, if it's a long list of stuff, then you're going to want to think about some different survey methods to get that information. And I can answer questions about surveys too. And again, that link I'm going to give you, it has a sample survey on there, and you're welcome to change it or alter it in any way that you want for use. Next area I want to talk about is focus groups. There was a question that came in about focus groups, and I'm going to cover it, so that was really great. Some focus groups tips that I like to give people is usually during this planning process, it's 2 to 3 focus groups, each one 6 to 8 participants. If you're a larger library, I would say you can bump this up to 12 to 16 participants, and you just got to make sure you have a pretty strong facilitator that can handle that many. Or you can have like breakout groups, so if you cut the room in half and then have each side kind of do stuff and then report out, that works pretty well too. Don't make them too long. There's a lot of people that are tempted for doing all-day focus groups. People get tired and they don't really give their full attention towards the end of the day. I'd rather have more shorter focus groups to talk to more people rather than like one really long focus group. So 30 to 90 minutes is usually what I cap it at. And if it's going well and there's a lot of conversation, I'll let it run to that 90 minutes. But you always want to make sure you let people out when you promise that you're going to let them out too. So that's one of the things we've learned along the way. The facilitator was the question that came through. So somebody asked the question, should we hire an outside consultant for a facilitator, or can we do it as a staff member or people that you already have? And I would say that people who make a good facilitator are someone who has a basic understanding of the library, someone who is well-spoken, and someone who can ask questions, subtly change directions in conversations, and shut down the people that are kind of over-talking or taking over the focus group. If you have someone in mind that can do that, that's great. Generally, I would discourage you from having either the director take that role or a staff person, mainly because if somebody knows the library pretty well, like from the community, if they come in and the library director is leading the focus group, they may not be as open to the idea of sharing all of their maybe frustrations, because that's one of the questions that I asked during the focus groups. So it's nice to have somebody that knows about the library, but is pretty much separate from anyone who works at the library. And I wouldn't say that you necessarily have to hire a consultant for that. Maybe you know someone who is well-spoken that's able to facilitate a focus group in a way that's going to be effective. But you just need somebody who isn't going to sit there and ask questions, but can engage with people and ask the questions in a way that pulls responses out. Facilitating, it can be kind of difficult, so you want to make sure that you have somebody that is not afraid to stand up and talk in public and who can communicate in an effective way. Other things that you're going to want to consider when you're talking focus groups is it's really nice to have a note taker. So when I'm facilitating a focus group, it's tough to kind of hear what everybody's saying and also lead the conversation in the right direction. So having somebody that sits down and can just type everything up, you can do it. So a lot of people like to have the big flip chart post-it notes and write everything down, and that's great, and go ahead and do it. I do it from time to time, but it's also nice to have a secondary person there kind of catching stuff. I get the question, is it appropriate to record focus groups? Sure, if you get the permission from everybody who's participating, but you also have to think, do you want to sit there and watch or listen to an entire focus group again? So sometimes it's just nice to have somebody taking notes so you can just read through a transcript of it as opposed to sitting through the whole thing all over again. I say 2 to 3 community focus groups and then 1 staff focus group. So this is the full staff, and I would say that this definitely does not have the director involved with it. Whether you have really good feelings about your staff really likes you or they don't really like you, if you're not there, it's a lot easier for them to talk about their successes and their problems, and then take full account of everything, and then make sure that you tell the staff, whoever the facilitator is, that names won't be attached to specific comments, because that's a big thing. The whole point of having a focus group is to gather people's opinions, not to gather who said the opinions, but what the opinions actually are, so you can move forward in addressing those. Finding focus group participants, that can sometimes be a challenge for libraries, and the first thing that I like to say about that is it's kind of that crap in, crap out type situation. So if you don't spend any time and you just kind of gather a handful of people and throw them in a room and it wasn't intentional, sometimes it's not going to be the best focus group that you can imagine. You really have to sit down and think about who's going to be a good participant in this focus group, who has a good representation in the community. Some libraries get stuck on the idea of making sure that they have a lot of businesses represented, which that's fine, and you definitely want to have business representation, but you don't want to overlook just the general people who live in the community and use the library too. Finding good focus group participants, it depends on if you want a homogeneous group or if you want like a good mixture of people too. There's pros and cons to having both. If you really want everybody the same who's representing the same organization, sometimes it works out better rather than doing a focus group, visiting an organization or visiting a club meeting or something like that and asking questions. That's a really great way to get points across, as well as talk to people about how they feel about the library, what their frustrations are. And I would say if you're going to visit a group, it's okay for the library director to take that one, because it's also has a lot to do with advocacy too when you're going out and doing outreach in that capacity. You're going to want to get a variety of people, so jobs, ages, populations. One age group that I say don't bother with, and hear me out before you balk at this, but don't invite teens. And what I mean by that is don't invite there's libraries that say, we want to have a focus group and we want to make sure that we have one teen that attends that focus group. That's a bad idea. Every focus group that I've attended that they've tried to do that, there's a teen there. They're not in each situation they haven't been very comfortable because it's a group of adults and then a teen, and all of the adults are interested in what the teen is going to say, and it makes for a very uncomfortable dynamic. So if you want teen opinion, which is good, and I would recommend that, it's better to have a teen-geared focus group, which is a little bit different than having an adult one. But for the comfort of everybody, I would say leave teens out of the adult focus groups and have something else set up for that to gather that. You're going to want forward thinkers, people who are articulate, not just people who talk. You want people who have substance to what they say. And when you're recruiting people for a focus group, I think it's pretty important that you have people invite people, as opposed to hanging up a sign that says, we're having a focus group at this time, feel free to show up, or feel free to sign up, or whatever. It works a lot better if, like I said earlier, you're intentional about who you're inviting, and you know the people who are in your community and the people that you want to talk to. And the board can help out with that too. Usually board members are fairly well connected and they can get people in the building. I always discourage boards. I always tell them to think of their 5 closest friends or family members that would be really easy to get to a focus group, and then forget about those 5 because they're not allowed to invite them. Because that's another thing. You want to make sure that they're really intentional about who you're picking out, not just making it the easiest focus group that is possible. Because no matter how good of a facilitator you get for your focus group, if you don't have the right mix of people, it's not going to work out that well. Some things I've learned along the way is if you are going to have multiple focus groups, sometimes it's nice to plan them all in one day, like a morning, an afternoon, and an evening. That saves travel time and costs if you're hiring a facilitator. 6 to 8 is a minimum. You can always do larger groups if you need to. I already talked about 90 minutes as an end time. Find an outside facilitator, have a note taker, and one question that comes up is, can the trustee or director attend the focus group, not as a participant, but just there as a note taker? And I would say if one trustee wants to attend, that's fine, and they can even act as the note taker, which works out really well. The caveat is they're not allowed to talk during the focus group. So no matter who's there, whether it's the director, if the director decides to come or the trustee comes, I would advise that those people don't talk during the presentation, because what happens is people are like, well, I'd love it if the library did this, and then the director or the trustee jumps up and says, well, actually the library is already doing this and we've been doing it for X number of years. And what that does is it sets up that dynamic that people are going to be corrected every time they offer an opinion or a suggestion, and then nobody wants to say anything. So it's fine if they're there, and then they can do kind of a that type of they can highlight those opportunities that they have at the library already at the end of the focus group, but I'd say don't correct anyone during the focus group because it sets that dynamic that doesn't work out very well. Some questions that I like to ask during the focus group are, I talk about the main priorities or aspirations of the community. So you start wide talking about the community. That gets people thinking about, what's going on in their community, and then what the biggest challenges are community-wise. Again, we're not talking about the library here. And the reason you do this is because, one, it gets people thinking on a larger scale and not just thinking about the library, but it also shows what people's concerns are in their community. And sometimes if you say, what service do you want at the library, they may say, well, no, you're doing everything fine. But then if you say, what are the problems with the community, they may identify some areas of outreach or program innovation or something that you can use. So even though they're talking about the community, it's definitely usable for library information. And then I ask them, talking about their goals, aspirations, hobbies, what do they feel is the most important service that the library offers? So that gets down to specifically what the library has. And then we talk about frustrations, and this one, most groups, it usually takes a minute or two to pull some frustrations out because people are polite, they don't want to offend anyone. And usually at this point I assure people I'm not a part of the library and you're not going to offend me, and this information is meant to help the library, because looking at our inefficiencies is one of the best ways that we can improve. And then I talk about what one service or program that you could set up, that the library could offer that would be beneficial. And this sometimes morphs into the question, if you could design a new library for your community, what program, services, or resources would you include? And this just gets people thinking on a different level. So rather than thinking about the restrictions of your current library, what would you design if you had your own library? And some of these things, more space always comes up. And say that's not or like building an addition, that comes up a lot. And say that's not something that your library can do, that's fine. What they're actually saying with that is that they need shifted or different space within the library. So doing some type of space planning could be just as effective as adding an addition onto the library. So it's not, don't take everything people say at face value. It could be that you could solve an issue that people are having in a different way that they perceive the issue. So being able to take a look at that stuff can be pretty effective. And that's why doing this data analysis at the end takes a little while longer, because you want to make sure that you are effectively kind of understanding everything that people want. The 3 questions initiative, this is generally done by the director or somebody on the board, and these are essentially questions to interview community leaders, and it focuses on the challenges, the big decisions, and the aspirations, because when we're talking about the leadership in the community, you can help align the library with what your community is working on by looking at what challenges an organization is going to be facing, what big decisions they're going to have to make, and what aspirations they have. And if you can talk to organizations you're already partnering with, or ones you'd like to partner with, or just ones that you've never even thought about partnering with, and you get an idea of what they're thinking about, that can have a big influence on what you're thinking about in terms of planning. And these are just one-on-one conversations. Call them up, have a meeting, whatever works out pretty well. We try to get a handful of these every time we do a planning process. Some library directors are a little bit more comfortable with this than others, so this has a lot to do with your own comfort level when you're talking to people. And it's just a really simple interview. And brainstorming a list of people, we do that at the system. We talk to a library director and maybe a board member about writing that stuff down. But you can just do that in a board meeting, or talking to your board president, who are the most important people that we should be talking to in our community, and then brainstorming those ideas and then setting up appointments. Not that you have to set up appointments with all of them, or that you will be able to, but just kind of identifying those people and seeing who you should be talking to. It also helps the people you're interviewing understand how the library is working. So you're doing this as an effort to have your own planning done, but you can also use it as an advocacy point too. So after you ask these questions, they're probably going to have questions for you too. So make sure you're ready for that, and you can talk about what the library is doing, how they can help how you can help their organization, etc. And just having these short conversations can help out quite a bit. Board retreats. So this is an area that I get turned down the most on, because the boards that I've dealt with, they don't usually want to have any type of retreat. But I think these are pretty important, because while we are getting information from the community, library boards have really great ideas too, and they are the ones that are going to shape the direction. And in order to help the board think through their goals, ideas, and needs, we at the Pioneer Library System, we offer a space for our member libraries to come in, so it's kind of outside the normal board meeting agenda. Again, that's really good, because you don't want people stuck in that mindset of just approving things and then moving on. You want them to really think about what type of ideas that they have for the library. And usually some board retreat type focus group questions that come up are, we talk about the aspirations they have for the library, challenges, what goals so specific goals. So the aspirations are those lofty things that you want it to do. So I want the library to be a go-to resource for information. Okay, that's a lofty inspiration, but then as you're talking about those, then you can start to get down to specific goals that would help accomplish those types of things. So you're not developing necessarily the final goals that are going to be in your plan. This is just figuring out where the board's at when they're thinking about the library and the direction that they're going in. Talking about what success looks like for these goals, what concerns they have, and what circumstances need to change. And you may be reading through these questions and you kind of get the idea that this is kind of like a SWOT analysis that's done through the board without calling it a SWOT analysis, because what I found is when you say, all right guys, let's get together to do a SWOT, there's a lot of people that either, one, don't know what that is, or two, they've been involved with large-scale planning projects before and they don't really want anything to do with it, or they phone it in. So just having questions where you kind of get at that information in a roundabout way works out pretty well. It's also a lot of fun if you have some activities for the board to do. One of them that I really like, that I actually stole from a book called Moments of Impact by Chris Ertel. This is Moments of Impact is about designing strategic conversations, and one of the games that I got out of that was breaking the board up into a couple groups and then saying, if a perfect competitor opened up across the street, what would they look like? So this is kind of the idea of designing your own library, but in this case it's designing some company that is going to compete with the library, take all the business away. And this works out pretty well because, one, you can see where your shortcomings are as a library, and two, sometimes you can have scalable ideas for programs, services, resources that you can have at the library that the board hasn't really thought about as an appropriate library resource, but it could be something that they're thinking about that you could get from somewhere else. And being able to pull that out of people is really, really good. I would say when you're doing anything like this, whether it's a board retreat, focus group, or whatever, the facilitator for this cannot be the library director. I would definitely say that you need to get an outside person to do that, but I would also encourage that the library director participate in this as well. Just because the library director is going to have a lot of good ideas that can play off of what the board's looking at too. And it's also a good instruction for the library director, because then you get kind of a better idea outside the day-to-day operations of what your board's thinking about, how they're thinking about it, and what their true ideas for the library are too. So it uncovers a lot of that communication that doesn't usually happen. Another exercise that I stole, this one came from Jamie LaRue from the Douglas County Libraries. He has the library access continuum, and essentially what this is you have two opposing ends of the spectrum. So if you look at this one, he has collection library versus creation library, and use stuff, make stuff, and then you have the staff, the board, and the community are all going to look at this axis, and they're going to put a post-it about where their library is currently, and then where they would like the library to be. And when you get this information, so if you're talking about the collection library, use stuff versus make stuff, so he has a bunch of them as well. He has physical to virtual, individual to community, collection to creation, or portal to archive. So he has these all set up, and then as you get kind of the information from each of these groups, you can see where do we have our directions lined up and where are our directions not lined up. So where is it not fitting with the staff, the board, or the community in what we want to do. And you can also prioritize what people are talking about, because once you're done with this exercise, you got to talk about it. So why do, so on the first one, say the pink was where we are and the orange is where you want to be. So why is it that people think that we're in a use stuff area versus a make stuff area, and why do they want to be in that make stuff area? What does it mean to them for a library that makes stuff? And then down at the bottom, so the community, they're kind of all across the board, so they have a very different perception of what the library is doing. And all of this can provide a lot of really interesting information when you're trying to put all this data together. And then the last step is bringing it all together. So we've talked about the collection tools, so getting a bunch of data from a bunch of different places, and then we need to talk about analysis of it. And this is kind of the one that people drag their feet on. I do a lot of the times too, because you have to look at this huge pile of responses that people send in for your survey, for your focus groups, for your board data. And what you want to do when you're working with a lot of data like this is you're going to read through everything, so you have a general idea of what it is, and then you need to find like the big buckets, so the big priorities that people are thinking about across the community, the board, and the library staff or the library director. And once you do this, you might have a handful of buckets that you're looking at, and then you continue to consolidate them. So are people talking about space in the library? Are people talking about programs in the library? Where are the overlaps between those two? And you want to narrow that down to about 3 to 4 priorities, so main focus areas. So these are just the broad strokes. So if a lot of people were talking about they want an addition on the library, and they want more bookshelves, and they're looking at more children's space, so that would all fall in that giant space bucket, okay? And those can become individual goals underneath it, but the library space is one of your main focus areas. That's your priority. And then you continue to review the information, and you put everything that would be in those buckets in there. So all that stuff I just mentioned about space, you would put it all in there. Anything that you're talking about programs, you'd put it all in there. And you would take a look at it and say what the library can do versus what the library isn't in a position to do right now. So the library may not be in a position to add an addition onto the library. I'm thinking additions and stuff a lot because it's construction grant season is opening up, and I'm doing a lot of work with that, so that's why I got space on the mind, on the brain. But say that you had space as one of your big buckets and you're talking about additions and you're talking about library space and everything else, and you're just assigning priority levels to this. Now this can be done individually, but it also can be done in your long-range planning committee or your board or however you're setting this up. This is going to take a little bit of time. I recommend having individuals do it on their own first rather than trying to plow through all this data in a meeting. Sometimes it's nice if you hire an outside facilitator because they'll just write a report for you and then you can use the report, so they'll do the bucket portion of it and say, you know, here are the trends that we've identified. Usually you're going to find like 5 to 10 big trends that are going to come through your data analysis, and once you find those, it's just a matter of figuring out what you want to focus on. So having 3 to 4, that's not to say we're going to ignore the rest of them. That's just to say we're putting them off. So right now they're not necessarily a high priority. So at the system, at the Pioneer Library System, we have goals every year, and usually we have about 4 big priority areas, and then we break it up into smaller subtasks that we're going to accomplish and who's in charge of that. And I always say SMART goals, and I realize that this becomes not a popular term because it's kind of overused, but it's pretty important because once you have your buckets and you're actually thinking about what you want to accomplish as a library, your goals really need to be as specific as humanly possible, very measurable because otherwise you're not going to know how it's done, attainable, so something you can actually accomplish, realistic, so it's not those lofty kind of aspirational stuff, it's really concrete, and then something that's time-bound. So that would be, it will be complete, or the section of it will be complete by the time this plan is over with. So those are kind of things that you want to think about as you're looking through all this data. And another thing that I'll give you is a really easy plan template, and that's part of the link that I'm going to share with everybody. But essentially our plan template has section 1 is just the planning summary. So this is a really brief overview of what process you went through. So anyone who looks at your plan knows like, oh, okay, this is how they got this information. Number 2 is your mission statement. I'm a strong believer that mission statements and kind of the guiding core value of your organization is really important when you're looking at planning, and not lofty mission statements. Again, something very specific and concrete. And then section 3, this is where you're going to talk about the goals. So you're going to have your goal, project, or priority, or whatever it is, so the big lofty stuff, and then you're going to say who's in charge of it, why you want to focus on this, how you're going to measure it, and then all the individual action items that you're going to do to accomplish it. So that's where you're going to actually get most of the work done. And once you have about 3 or 4 of those, you're going to realize that, you know, this is a lot of stuff, and I'm going to do a lot of stuff outside of these goals throughout the year, but this is really going to guide us in the direction that we want to do. So it's not to say that these 4 goals or projects or priorities are the only things we're going to work on, but these are what the community, the staff, and the board has identified as the most important things to get the library to move forward. And once you're done, whether it's a year or 3 years, then you're going to you're going to add more goals. If something wasn't accomplished, you're going to look at why wasn't this accomplished, and then you may want to re-up it, or maybe it was a project that wasn't really worth it, so you're going to drop it. So having a monthly update, or in your board report, having some type of update on this plan is really important, because that keeps your finger on the pulse of what is actually happening with this type of planning process, and I think it makes it a little bit more agile, because perhaps something that you decided was a pretty big goal for everybody at this time, something changed and it's not a goal anymore. So you may just axe that completely and then have a whole new project that takes its place, something like that. So it is a living document. It can change and it can be flexible. But you can take a look at the plan template that I'll give you, and you can kind of fill it in however you want. Again, feel free to change any of the information on here that you want. So what's next for this process and what I want to do? So essentially, I want to put together a suite of different surveys, which I've started to do, because I want to continue to move away from those large community surveys and focus more in on really specific stuff that the people that libraries want to know about. So how well are our hours? Okay, a combination between looking at your people counters versus having a survey versus talking to people in a focus group. All that information together can kind of give you a better idea. So I want to have individual small-scale surveys that test that kind of stuff that are really quick and libraries can just implement them. Project Outcome from PLA has been doing this quite a bit already. So I've been using them, and I've also been modeling a few things, a few of my surveys off of some stuff that they came out with as well, because all of those surveys have already been tested. If you don't know what Project Outcome is, definitely just PLA, Google search, or you can talk to somebody from PLA as well to get some more information on that one. I want to put together a tool or an easy report schedule for libraries to be able to update what they are doing on their plan for their board reports, so something where they can just plug in information and send it. I want to get at least 40% of our libraries done with planning by the end of the year, so that's another goal that I have for what's next. I want to continue to rework the board retreat thing. I'm not really sure why that's not that interesting to boards right now, but I definitely want to get some more information to help them out. And I also want to start compiling all of this information, because I think that a lot of the libraries that we have, a lot of our communities have some similar overlaps, so I want to start taking a look at the survey data and putting it together with other libraries and getting kind of a larger scale of what's happening, the bigger picture across the system, and being able to make decisions based off of that as well. So just kind of looking at a database of priorities and the data that came out of that, so I can just hand it over to libraries and they can say, okay, well, this is one thing that I haven't really thought about, but it's kind of a good idea. So that's kind of where I'm at with the next steps for this. If you go to our website, pls-net.org/plan, you'll get a PDF with kind of what I talked about today and a little bit more explanation of a few things. You are always welcome to get in touch with me. My name is Ron Kirsop. Again, I work at the Pioneer Library System. Once everybody's had a chance to write this down, I'll flip to the next slide, which has my contact information. But that's pretty much all that I have to give you kind of a quick overview of what the planning process entails that we're working with. And if you guys have any questions, I'd love to take them. Kelsey, are you still on?